Welcome to another week of our 4.5-year verse-by-verse journey through all of God's inspired word. This week we will be looking at the Last Supper of Jesus, spent with his apostles before he went to the cross as the atoning sacrifice for sin. I want to talk a little bit about the Passover in order to set the background for this meal. The original Passover took place in conjunction with Israel's departure from Egypt under the leadership of Moses in order to head to the Promised Land. You remember that this comes as the climax of the 10 plagues. One of the last plagues was 3 days of darkness. And evidently, before those 3 days of darkness commenced, Moses had ordered all the Israelis to designate the perfect Passover lamb that was going to spend the next several days inside the house with them. When the 14th day of the first Jewish month came, all the Israelis were commanded to kill their Passover lambs between the evenings of the 14th. And it's generally understood that the Israelis all killed their Passover lambs in the afternoon of the 14th, before the sun went down. And then they began roasting that lamb, so that when the sun went down, marking the beginning of the 15th, which is the first day of the unleavened bread ceremonies, they all went back into their homes, which had been marked with the blood of the lamb, and awaited the passing over of God's death penalty, the death of the firstborn, throughout Egypt. The only houses that did not suffer the loss of firstborn were those that were blood marked by the Passover lamb. And so that's where we get the name Passover and where we get the designated days. The 14th day of the first month was when the Passover lambs were supposed to be killed. The 15th day was the beginning of unleavened bread. The 10th day of the month was the day on which all Passover lambs were designated. And so Jesus is going to end up fulfilling the prophecies related to the Passover lamb and unleavened bread. He had his triumphal entry into the city of Jerusalem on the 10th day of the first Jewish month. He then will die on the 14th day of the first Jewish month, when most, or at least many, of the Jews were killing their Passover lambs. And then he will be buried by the time the sun goes down and the 15th day of the Jewish month begins, and the Feast of Unleavened Bread begins ticking off. Now, with all of that background information, the question is automatically asked, how is it then that Jesus was able to eat the Passover lamb if he died at the same time as the Passover lamb? And the answer has to do with a quirk, as we Westerners would think of it, in the Jewish calendar. Jewish days, being tied to creation, darkness and light, Jewish days begin at sunset and end the following sunset. So for the Jewish people in Jesus' day, in this particular week that we're looking at, the 14th day of the Jewish month began at sunset on Thursday night and will finish at sunset on Friday night. And so it would appear that at least some Jewish groups, perhaps Galileans among them, began their Passover on the evening of the 14th as it began. They would wait until the sun went down, butcher their lambs, roast them, and eat them all before midnight. And then the following day, when the sun went down on the end of the 14th, they would then continue with their celebration of the Feast of Unleavened Bread on the 15th. So this is effectively going to allow Jesus to both be the Passover lamb symbolically on Friday the 14th and eat the Passover lamb after sunset on Thursday night, which is also the 14th on the Jewish calendar. If you've got questions about that, then please feel free to contact me, and I'd be happy to engage you on this aspect of understanding what happened in AD 33 for the death of Jesus. Now, for the apostles, we talked last session, at the end of last week, that Jesus does not give Judas the opportunity of knowing where he and the apostles will commemorate the Passover meal on Thursday night, because Judas has already made the commitment to look for an opportunity to betray Jesus when he is away from the large crowds. The Sanhedrin had met in special session on Wednesday night, hoping that they could come up with a plan to track Jesus down after the Passover was over, when he was away from the crowds, arrest him, and then dispose of him quickly. But Judas Iscariot came to them apparently at that special Wednesday night meeting, and in his disillusion about Jesus, apparently having come to the conclusion that Jesus was not the Messiah he was looking for, Judas offered to betray him privately in order to get 2 months' worth of wages, 30 silver shekels, and he would do this away from the crowd. And so that advanced their plan, so that if they can get a hold of him on Thursday night, late in the day, as in overnight, then they figure that they can rush everything, condemn him, and hand him over to the Romans for crucifixion, and have that as a fait accompli, an accomplished thing, by the time anyone is up and around on Friday morning. And so that's the plan that the Sanhedrin was hoping for, and which Judas was trying to carry out. And Jesus short-circuits it by giving a supernatural sign to Peter and John, whom he's tasked to go and prepare the Passover meal. He tells them, go from Bethany on the Mount of Olives, where they're staying every night, into the city of Jerusalem. You're going to see a man carrying a container of water, probably up on his head, which would be exceptionally unusual. Follow that guy to the house that he goes into, enter that house, and say to the master there, where is that upper room that is prepared for the Passover meal so that I can observe it with my disciples? And evidently, God had already worked things out supernaturally with the owner of that house to have the upper room completely fitted out with everything that John and Peter would need in order to cook and lay out the Passover meal. And so Jesus shows up at the upper room, a top secret location, probably in the wealthier part of Old Jerusalem, which would be the western hill of the upper city, and Judas has no opportunity to let the authorities know that's where he's located. We have 4 passages that we're going to glean information from about what happened at the upper room, and we have to bounce quite a bit in order to get all the bits and pieces, all the little details in. So I'd like for you to have your 4 markers in Matthew 26, Mark 14, Luke 22, and John 13. Now, Peter and John are going to take probably 3-4 hours butchering and cooking on a spit over an open fire the Passover lamb. And so that will all be ready to go because they didn't start until sunset on Thursday night, because that's when the 14th starts. So more than likely, this meal that we're going to be looking at does not get started officially until well after dark, probably 10 o'clock or so. And that is why things go so late into the night for Jesus' trial. So we are told in Luke chapter 22, verse number 14, when the hour came, he reclined at table and his apostles with him. So Jesus has arrived with the other 10. Some of their family members might also be in the Jerusalem area for the Passover time, so they also might be part of this Passover meal. We can't be sure as to exactly who else might have been at this table. But it is likely that they would have butchered 2 lambs because the Old Testament law made provision that for every 10 adult men, you butchered 1 Passover lamb, and so they would have needed at least 2. Now, it was typical that they would recline on their left elbow, and they would eat with their right hand, their left shoulder kind of pointing toward the table. Their feet would be pointing away from the table, and people would be up close and personal to one another. The head spot, as I mentioned last session, would belong to Jesus, and the spot on his right, that's on his chest side, would be the number 2 position in order of 1 and 2 on his right and left. The number 1 spot would be behind him, because you always gave your back to the person you trusted the most. That's the theory of placement here. The Jewish people, the Jewish society of this time, was very cognizant of where you fit in your social hierarchy. And where you're seated in a formal dining area indicates where you fit in what we would say is the pecking order. And I shared with you last time, we can be certain that the Apostle John was in front of Jesus, because in his gospel, he talks about leaning back on Jesus' chest and speaking privately with him. I told you that the other place of prominence, the number 1 spot at Jesus' back, went to Judas Iscariot. How do we know that? Because in the story, Jesus and Judas have a very intimate private conversation revolving around him dipping something in the common bowl and handing it to him to eat. And no one hears any of that conversation except for John, evidently, and he didn't fully comprehend it at the time. And so that is our way of knowing how they were placed, at least Jesus and the number 1 and 2 spots. It would appear that when they came to the upper room, there was no servant on duty at the door to wash feet. And so it should have happened that the most junior member of their party should have stopped and volunteered to help everybody off with their feet and help them off with their sandals and wash their feet on their way in. But nobody did that. Everybody instead scrambled to find their place of position at the table. And so that's where we're at right now. It's probably after 10 o'clock. We've rushed into the room. Feet have been left unwashed. And Jesus is grieving in his heart about what is on the horizon before this night is over and what will transpire on the following day. He also knows that he's got very little time left to prepare his 12 apostles, 11, since one of them is a betrayer, for their responsibilities that will follow hereafter. So let's take all of that thinking, all of that emotion, all of that background, and read some more from Luke's account. Luke 22, verse 15. He said to them, I have earnestly desired to eat this Passover with you before I suffer. For I tell you, I will not eat it until it is fulfilled in the kingdom of God. So Jesus effectively welcomes them with these words that I have very much wanted to spend this special time with every last one of you before the prophecies start getting fulfilled. And I'm telling you that I will not again participate in this Passover meal ceremony until it's all been fulfilled the way it's supposed to be. Now, it would appear that Jesus' words there are about the Lamb's feast. That is the marriage supper of the Lamb that will take place at his second coming, at the inauguration of his millennial kingdom. Because he will mention that he's not going to eat of the bread or drink of the cup until he drinks it anew with them in the kingdom. And when the Apostle Paul makes comment about Jesus' words in the Lord's Supper, he says, we do this in remembrance of Jesus to commemorate his death until he comes again. So that seems to be where Jesus is going with these initial words at the beginning of the meal. Now, let me say a word about something that's become quite common in Christian circles today, and that is doing a Jewish Seder, S-E-D-E-R, where you do certain ceremonial Jewish things and tie them into things related to Jesus. Let me give you this caveat. The Jewish Seder ceremony is almost certainly not representative of the first century A.D. Jewish Passover ceremony. It was developed in the second century and after, and many of its components were put in place by those that had no connection to the first century whatsoever. So many things had happened. The temple had been destroyed in AD 70. The Jews had lost their homeland and their capital city. And then by the time the 130s rolled around and the Bar Kokhba rebellion took place, Judaism became very much hated by an awful lot of the people of the Roman Empire. And anti-Semitism itself was even happening inside the church. And so the Judaism itself began to change and morph because of that hateful reaction to it in the late first century and the beginning of the second century. And so when they developed their Seder, they developed it with all that background. And so I hesitate to recommend Passover Seders. I understand that there's a lot of touching moments and tie-ins to Christian ideals, but I don't want you to picture that that's what's happening here. It does appear that there's some ceremony involved in the first century, such as multiple cups were used to, as we would say, toast the remembrance of what the Passover meal represents, which is the departure from Egypt after the death of the firstborn. And so we're going to see one of those cups at the beginning of the meal here in a moment. But also the pieces of the meal itself are highly symbolic. The Passover lamb, without its bones being broken, will eventually represent Jesus being that Passover lamb that dies on the 14th. The bitter herbs, such as probably bitter lettuces and radishes and things of that nature that would have been fresh during this time of year, they represented the bitterness of the bondage of Egypt. The asking of a question by someone, usually a child, that was seated at the table. Why is this day, this night, so much more significant for us than any other? We know in the writings of Moses that they were told to make sure that their young people understood the significance of this and other events in Israeli history. So I anticipate all of that would have been part of the original Passover ceremonies. Now, with Jesus, the focus, though, is going to be on everything that he has to say. And so that's where I want us to focus as well. So in verse 17 of Luke 22, when it says, he took a cup, and when he had given thanks, he said, take this and divide it amongst yourselves. This is the beginning of the Passover meal. This is the initial cup. This is the kickoff to the meal. It is the blessing cup, if you will, for everything that follows. But Jesus emphasizes again that this is a significant watershed event for he and the disciples. For I tell you that from now on I will not drink of the fruit of the vine until the kingdom of God comes. Now, the next thing that Luke talks about is the establishment of what we refer to as the Lord's Supper or communion. Perhaps you use the more technical term, Eucharist. This doesn't happen until later in the ceremony. And so I want to move instead to John chapter 13 at this point. So my guess is that after Jesus kicks off the meal with the initial cup, that he then turns his attention to the fact that when they came in, all the disciples blew off the idea of becoming the voluntary foot slave at the door. And so Jesus, almost at the very beginning of the meal, teaches them a lesson about servant leadership. You know that this has been a big deal repeatedly with him, and it's all revolving around this idea of the hierarchy within the society. Just only a few days earlier, They had an argument about which ones of them were the greatest because James and John had tried to secure for themselves the number 1 and 2 spot in the coming kingdom. So we know that the apostles are spatting with one another constantly about where they fit in the hierarchy of the 12. So now they've all bypassed the opportunity to be a servant in order to get to their spot at the table. So this is what happens. Chapter 13 of John, verse number 2. During supper, when the devil had already put it into the heart of Judas Iscariot, Simon's son, this is Simon, Judas's dad, not Simon Peter, okay, to betray him. So we already know that happened. Wednesday night, he'd made a deal. This is now Thursday night, and he's looking for a chance to betray Jesus. So verse 3, Jesus, knowing that the Father had given all things into his hands, and that he had come from God, and that he was going back to God. So this is the Apostle John commenting on it 30 years later, and he says, I know now, I understand now what was in Jesus' heart that night. That he knew what was coming, he knew why he was here, he knew where he was going next. He did this for us. Verse 4, he rose from the supper. He laid aside his outer garments, and taking a towel, tied it around his waist. Then he poured water into a basin and began to wash the disciples' feet and to wipe them with the towel that was wrapped around him. So Jesus, at the beginning of the meal, gets up from the table, from the chief spot, and goes and voluntarily takes on the guise and the responsibility of the foot slave, and begins to wash every last one of the apostles' feet. What an amazing example of servant leadership.